Welcome everyone to the third webinar in Women's Advocates, a Domestic Violence Shelter in St. Paul, Minnesota, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, or SAM. My name is Bredesen Wheeler. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Advocates. Just a few quick announcements and reminders. We will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar and a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. At the end of the webinar, I will also send information on how to receive and request a certificate of attendance in the chat and also in the follow-up email. I also want to acknowledge and extend gratitude to our American Sign Language, or ASL, interpretation services, which are provided by ThinkSelf Minnesota, Deaf Education and Advocacy's Specialized Interpreting Fellowship Training, or SIFT program. We're also so grateful to have the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or MNCASA's Prevention and Sexual Exploitation Specialist Hunter Beckstrom here to present on sexual violence and healthy relationships. We encourage you all to take care of yourself during this presentation. The information discussed may be uncomfortable or triggering for some of you. If you would like some support via online chat, feel free to reach out to the largest anti-sexual violence organization, www.online.rain.org. I'll also send that in the chat. And lastly, we invite you to send questions in the Q&A. And now I'll pass it on to Hunter. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Bredesen. Can everyone hear me? Just want to double check that I am all good on the audio. All right, I think so. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for some folks as well, because I can tell that we have folks from all across the United States. That is so very exciting. Very excited to be here, and thank you so much to Bredesen and the folks at Women's Advocates for having me be a part of this process for SAM, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, in April as well. So today, as you can see, I will be chatting with you all about sexual violence and healthy relationships in general. I will do a little bit of additional introduction. So once again, Hunter Beckstrom, I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am the Prevention and Sexual Exploitation Specialist at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I'm kind of in an interesting position because I split half my time toward prevention work and then also with the Minnesota Safe Harbor, which deals specifically with folks who are experiencing sex trafficking and or sexual exploitation as well. So I work with different teams across the state of Minnesota as well, who provide that type of assistance and response. But today I am going to be focusing on the prevention piece mostly as well. So with that, we can jump in a little bit here. I want to make sure I will slow down a little bit because I know that we have some ASL interpreters as well, so my apologies. But going over some of the learning objectives about what we're going to be chatting about today. Number one, I just want to have us create a solid foundational understanding of what sexual violence is. I know that we have a lot of folks who are likely familiar with what sexual violence is and other forms of violence like domestic violence, sex trafficking, stalking, so many different things like that. But just want to make sure that we are all on the same page with sexual violence as well. I also want to introduce some concepts about what prevention is. I know that there's a huge broad spectrum of what prevention is, but also once again, making sure that we all have a good, solid understanding of that as well. And then finally, also want to provide some education on how I talk to youth about healthy relationship skills. I know that specifically when I use the word youth, I'm using that term very broadly. So I am talking about folks and youth who are in ages 4th, 5th, 6th grade, all the way up to college individuals as well. So early 20s, late teens as well. So once again, just want to explain that I use the term youth quite broadly. And I know that a lot of folks on this call have likely done a lot of education on healthy relationships as well. But this is just the way that myself and other folks at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault discuss that as well. A few other things I just want to make folks be aware of is that this is a 101 training. And so I know that we have probably centuries worth of skills and knowledge and expertise within sexual violence and prevention in general. But I really want to be able to learn from you all as well today. So please feel free to be asking questions in the chat. I will monitor it to the best that I possibly can. But I know that Bernison will be helping out as much as possible as well. So please just feel free to answer or ask any questions throughout the presentation. I will have a little bit of time left at the end to open it up as well, but please want to have this to be as interactive as possible and answer any questions throughout that I possibly can. All right. Also, I just want to be able to share a little bit about who I am, because I think it's very important within the world of advocacy and the anti-violence movement that we really address who we are and how we bring ourselves into this movement, because it really is a journey. And I think that is so important to be able to come back to as much as possible, right? And I know that for myself, I come from very many privileged identities. For example, I am a white, straight, cisgender male, and coming into that, that brings a lot of dynamics and interesting, personalities of privilege within this type of work, because we know that the vast majority of folks experiencing different types of sexual violence are female identified, and we know that it's not a large amount of male identified folks who commit these crimes, but it is largely male identified folks who do commit these crimes of sexual violence as well. So I do think it's very important that we name who we are coming into these types of movements. And I know that for myself, coming from these very privileged identities, I think that's very important to name as well. Additionally, I started my work within the anti-violence movement in 2015. So that is about 6 years being in this movement. And I know that I have a lot of knowledge and expertise, but I also know that so many people on the call today likely have decades of experience as well, right? And so just being aware of that, I really have a growth mindset. I always want to learn constantly and all the time. So once again, like I said before, I would love to learn so much from you all. I think that's such an important aspect that we're consistently and always learning all of the time. So definitely want to hope that I'm going to educate you all on some different aspects of this presentation today, but also want to know some interesting facts from you all and anything that you want to share as well. So with that, I think we can dive into the actual content of this presentation again. So first of all, I want to address what is sexual violence here. So to be clear, I think it's always important to be able to begin in providing a definition of what sexual violence is. And according to MNCASA, we provide our own definition of what that is. And sexual violence is the use of sexual actions and or words that are unwanted and or harmful to another person. So I think it's very important to have that foundational understanding of what sexual violence is. But even when we begin breaking that down, sometimes it becomes a little convoluted, right? So what are sexual actions, for instance? What does it mean to have those actions be unwanted or harmful to a person, and how so many people can interpret that differently as well. But really beginning with this solid understanding of what sexual violence is, right? And for the terms of this presentation, I think it's important to note that sexual violence and how we explain that at MNCASA is that it is essentially an umbrella term that includes multiple types of violence. So that can be rape, it can be sexual assault, it can be child sexual abuse, it can include different types of trafficking and exploitation as well. So keeping in mind that sexual violence is understood as an umbrella term to envelop these different types of violence. Additionally, I think it's very important to note that historically, a lot of these different types of forms of sexual violence have been used interchangeably. For instance, a lot of times people utilize the terms rape and sexual assault to mean the same thing. But we have to know that they are also different as well. So looking at sexual assault being any type of physical unwanted touch, groping, anything like that, right? Whereas rape deals specifically with penetration. And that point is important to talk about penetration of genitals. It can be of a body part, a digit such as fingers, but then also an object as well, right? So I think that's very important to be able to parse out how these different terms can be different as well, even though so many different types of organizations and historically they have been used interchangeably. But being clear that this is kind of the understanding of sexual assault that we will be learning about today in purpose of this training. Jumping into the next slide as well, I really want to be able to share about how sexual violence can be very different again, right? So talking about in the context of Minnesota, for example, because that is the state in which I am working from, when we're talking about sexual violence specifically, the court system of Minnesota talks about that being criminal sexual conduct. And that looks like, for example, number one, a person engaging in non-consensual consensual sexual contact, or to a person engaging in masturbation or lewd exhibition of the genitals in presence of another person, specifically a minor as well. So specifically, we have to be aware of how in different contexts, sexual violence might mean something else. So for example, sexual violence being a crime, that has to be explained the language has to be framed very specifically, right? Because prosecutors have to be able to charge that. So that is just in the context of a state law within the state of Minnesota. If we jump down to the next point here, looking at the CDC, because so many different organizations across the United States follow guidance from the CDC, they explain that sexual violence refers to sexual activity when consent is not obtained or freely given. So once again, I think that's important because both within the Minnesota state statute and within the CDC, we are talking about what consent is, right? And we are going to be talking about consent later, but as I talked about previously, it's very important to note that when you are breaking down these actual definitions, even the terms within those definitions can be quite confusing for some folks as well. So that's why we also have to have a solid understanding of what consent is. Finally, we also have to bring that into the context of across the nation and being worldwide. So for example, the World Health Organization terms sexual violence as any sexual act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, or unwanted sexual comments or advances, or acts to traffic or otherwise directed against a person's sexuality using coercion by any person, regardless of their relationships to that victim in any setting, including but not limited to home and work. Okay, wow, that was a very long and lengthy definition, but at the same time, it is very broad and very inclusive, right? And I think that is very important for a worldwide context as well, because there are so many different dynamics when we are looking from each nation to a different nation, being within the United States, being across the world, different cultural contexts as well, and so important. So I know that I threw up a lot of text and definitions here on this slide, but I think it's also very important to note that when we are talking about what actually constitutes sexual violence is that it can be quite different depending on the person, place, and time that you are talking about what sexual violence is. Additionally, I think because these are within organizational practices or within a statewide or worldwide context, it's also important to note that this can be very different for people in the community, but also for victims and survivors as well. So a victim or survivor of sexual assault might actually identify with sexual violence in a different way. So for example, you might recall that I work with sex trafficking victims and survivors as well. And historically, I've worked in shelters for those folks as well. And I think it's very important to note that oftentimes, not all youth, for example, but some youth who are in the life of trafficking and or exploitation will oftentimes refer to just being in the life, but not actually identifying as a victim or survivor of sexual violence, for example, or exploitation. So some folks or some communities might not actually have that specific language to explain what their experience is, or they just might have a very different experience of what that idea of sexual violence is between a community context and then also how an organization might actually name or define what sexual violence is. And please, if anyone has any questions throughout, please once again, just type in the chat and let me know as we continue on. I also think we have to be able to parse out what sexual violence is according to being physical, verbal, and visual once again, right? So even as we continue to break down the definition of what sexual violence is, we have to be aware of how it can look quite differently as well when we're talking about these three different types of sexual violence. So first of all, looking at physical sexual violence, that is typically what people begin to think of right away as how sexual violence is manifested. So looking at examples of physical sexual violence, once again, that can be any form of unwanted groping, physical touch, once again being sexual assault, rape, anything including within that type of physical action as well. I think it's also very important to go over what visual sexual violence as well. So that can be within a location or even a workplace of having inappropriate or lewd images as well. That can be, especially within a workplace, I think that's very important to note. Additionally, this can be pornography in any way. This can be also child pornography as well, and disseminating that, especially when someone, in a partnership or not, someone might be sending, nude photos, for example, but another person will actually disseminate that without that person's consent. That is also visual examples of what sexual violence is as well. Finally, looking at the verbal piece as well. This is talking, oftentimes people think about this as sexual harassment within the workplace. So this can be inappropriate comments when it comes to talking about sex within the workplace. This can be rape jokes as well, but also just in general, having that harmful or degrading language about specifically women oftentimes within the workplace, but anything that can be harmful or degrading language as well. So once again, just keeping it in mind that there's different types of sexual violence when we're breaking down between physical, verbal, and visual, but these are all very harmful examples no matter which one we are talking about as well. Jumping into the next slide, I do want to talk about the prevalence of sexual violence as well. So once again, I think that a lot of folks are likely familiar with a lot of some of these statistics, but once again, just want to have a solid foundational understanding that everyone can come back to once again. So looking at about 1 in 5 women in the United States will report a completed or attempted rape at some point in their life, and that number is about 2.6 of all United States men. So once again, these are huge numbers, over in the millions once again. And just a quick note, y'all will see at the end in brackets, I do include where I am finding this information. So the NSVRC is the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. The NISVS is actually the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey, which is done by the CDC. And at the end, you will see the Human Rights Campaign for HRC. I also think it's very important to begin to kind of break down how sexual violence is experienced when we are talking about the context of different identities. So looking at this piece of intersectionality, which we will talk about briefly later on, but this idea of intersectionality that is talking about people's different types of identities and social categories. So that can be their gender identity, their race, their sexual orientation, their range of ability, so many different things like that, and how they converge and really influence that person's lived experience. So looking at this, breaking it down into gender, but specifically looking at women, so about 3.5 out of every 10 white women will experience victimization of sexual assault in their lifetime. However, when we continue to break that down, that rate is increased to 4 in 10 for Native, Black, and Hispanic women, and 5 in 10, so half of all multiracial women as well. Breaking this down even more when we are talking about specifically male victims again, so an estimated about 1 in 4, so 24% of male victims of sexual violence are experiencing sexual violence had a disability at the time, whereas almost 40% of female victims had a disability at the time of their victimization as well. Continuing to break down a little bit more when we are talking about folks in the LGBTQIA plus communities, that's the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer, intersex, and for example, sometimes agender or asexual as well, folks. So those numbers are 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, and those numbers are 26% for gay men, and then also 37% for bisexual men as well. And then finally, when we are talking about transgender folks, about 47% of all people are sexually assaulted at some point in their life. So I think that piece is very important to note. So when we begin intersecting these very marginalized identities, it's very common to have those rates of violence be even more increased as well. I want to be able to look at the chat real quick. Looks like folks are still identifying themselves and where they are from, but it looks like someone has their hand raised. If folks have any questions at all, just want to double check. I know oftentimes when someone is doing that, they might have a question or comment. I'm going to look through the comments real quick to see if someone has anything. So I'm seeing in the chat, someone asked, is the stats on a national level or localized? So for the NSVS, that is the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey. And so that is on a national context as well, to be clear on that. And then also with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and Human Rights Campaign, that is also on a national level as well. All right, and then someone also asked a question, has there been any statistics on the prevalence of sexual violence since the pandemic? I'm not sure specifically on any type of data on that point. I think we're going to continue to understand a lot more on the prevalence of how the pandemic and COVID-19 has been such an influence. I do know that, for example, when we're kind of looking at the convergences of domestic violence and sexual violence, especially during the pandemic, when so many people were at home with their potential abusers as well, who might be committing domestic and sexual violence at the same time, and where that victim or survivor might not be able to reach out to any services for help or to be able to break away from that perpetrator. There might have been, I know that there was, for instance, spikes in calls to national helplines, for example, but obviously constantly being around the perpetrator, for example, when we're talking about domestic violence, can be quite difficult in being able to get true numbers, because once again, we know that reporting rates are oftentimes quite low, unfortunately, still. So hopefully I did answer that question and everything, but please, if folks need any type of clarifying information, please continue to let me know. Look in the chat one more time to see if folks have any questions. All right, wonderful. All right, with that, we will jump into the next slide, and this is looking at the impact of sexual violence. So once again, I know that most folks might be pretty familiar with how sexual violence impacts a person, but once again, just want to make sure that we are all coming from the same understanding. So according to RAINN, I know that Brennison had brought up this organization before, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. Sorry, just making sure to monitor the chat because I know that we got a lot of folks still sharing. Okay, sounds good. So just going through this a little bit more, looking at the impact of sexual violence. According to RAINN, 94% of women who were raped experienced symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder during the 2 weeks following that instance of rape, for example. I think, we know that some of the symptoms of PTSD are also included with the common reactions that are a little bit lower on the slide. For example, that can be increased examples of depression or anxiety. That can also be having nightmares, things like that within PTSD. But then also about 70% of rape or sexual assault victims and survivors experience moderate to severe distress, which is a larger percentage compared to other types of violence crime once again as well. Also, about 38% of victims of sexual violence experience work or school problems as well, which I think is very important to note because so many folks, they have trouble attending school or attending their actual work, and a lot of, potential for losing wages or even losing their job or getting behind in homework or classes as well. That point is very important. Additionally, want to go over the common reactions once again very briefly, looking at guilt, self-blame or isolation, nightmares, numbness, potential lack of control. And I want to be clear on this point of lack of control, meaning, for example, that that victim or survivor might feel as they don't have any type of control because of experiencing that sexual assault, not necessarily that they're out of control. I just want to make that clear. But also having symptoms of depression or anxiety, eating disorders where that is additional or less eating potentially, substance abuse as well, low self-esteem, and obviously so much more. Do want to point out that once again, these can be common reactions as well, but that's not to say if someone is not experiencing these that is an indication that they are not going through the same situation, for example, right? So someone can have any number of kind of reactions to experiencing sexual violence or any other kind of violence as well. On this last point, I think this is always very important. I know that, when I'm doing these types of trainings, talking about sexual violence and the impact, I definitely want to hope that so many people are like, oh my gosh, this is the impact of sexual violence. So many people are experiencing this type of violence. The impact of it is just so severe. It has such a negative impact on these people. But I know that not all types of people are keeping this in mind and really wanting to combat that. And that's why I really try to include a financial aspect to experiencing violence and sexual assault as well. And so this is actually, you can see the citation down here, but these folks, Peterson, DeGue, Florence, and Loki, were actually from the CDC as well. And in 2017, they did this article on the lifetime cost of rape. And I think it's very important to note that, experiencing sexual violence, obviously for that individual is, so difficult, has such a negative impact, and healing is so important. But on looking at the financial aspects, it is quite expensive actually. So this is looking at the estimated number is $120,000 per victim. And that is including, for example, so it's looking at the criminal justice system. So it can look at incarceration rates, it can look at time for prosecution, and looking at services for other organizations. But it also includes that number of over 120,000 is any type of lost wages for victims and survivors. It can include any type of rehabilitative services, so seeking types of counseling and or therapy. So it includes a lot of different numbers, not only on the systems that these victims and survivors might be reaching out to, but also just the actual cost of the victim and survivor that they might be losing to because they're not going to work anymore because of that specific experience, for example. But that number, once again, is over 120,000, and that is multiplied by over the 25 million folks who reported rape. And once again, this is going back to the NISVS as well, so the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey, which identified 25 million men and women across the state had experienced rape. So if you multiply these two numbers together, that is over 3 million in a lifetime for these individuals. So essentially every generation we're spending over $3 trillion when we are trying to respond to and provide services to victims and survivors of sexual violence once again. All right, it looks like someone might have raised their hand. Let's see. Oh, awesome. It looks like Brennison had included some a resource here for us. So looking at sexual violence and COVID as well. So I think that is wonderful. Just want to make sure, I feel like some folks might be raising their hand, but I am not seeing any comments. I know that Tremaine Palmer might have raised their hand. I'm going to allow you to chat in, Tremaine, if you wanted to ask a question real quick. Tremaine, did you have anything that you wanted to ask us? All right, if not, folks, please feel free to add something in the comment section as well, and I will definitely continue to monitor the chat with us today too. All right, so that was just kind of a foundational understanding once again of what sexual violence is. So I just want to be able to make sure that we're all coming from that same understanding. But once again, if anyone has any comments or questions, definitely happy to loop back around for that as well too. All right, sweet. We don't have any questions from Tremaine, but please, if folks have other questions, please let me know. So next I want to jump into actually preventing sexual violence and what that can look like as well. And then really having a deeper conversation of what prevention looks like. Just going to take a quick water break, folks. All right. So I would imagine some folks are familiar with the story of the three siblings. I know that there's a lot of different types of stories when folks are talking about prevention, and this specific story about prevention. Checking the chat one more time. Yes, of course. So Jamila had asked a question about providing certain slides or information. Yes, Brennison and folks at Women's Advocates will be sharing the slides as well, and I'm happy to provide additional links too. All right, so jumping into this story of the three siblings here. Once again, I think a lot of folks might be familiar and have heard different versions, but I did want to share this specific version for me. So when we're talking about the story of the three siblings, we have three siblings. It is a beautiful day, and they have decided to go for a picnic down by the river as well. And with this, they brought their cloth or blanket that they're gonna sit on. They brought sandwiches, chips, drinks, just to hang out by the river, have a beautiful day together as well. So as they're sitting down, they're just about to break into their lunch and their sandwiches. All of a sudden, they hear a yell for help. And all of a sudden they're panicking, they're looking around, what is going on? And they see someone is actually drowning in the river. So right away, one sibling is like, oh my gosh, we have to help this person. So jumps into the river, swims on over to that victim in the river, and is able to drag them onto shore and help them out. And that person who was in the river was like, oh my gosh, you're such a savior. Thank you so much for doing this. I don't know how to repay you. So thank God that this person was able to be saved from the river. Everything seems to be okay. So now the three siblings go back to their wonderful picnic that they are having together. But as right when they're about to jump into their picnic, once again, they hear another yell from the river. Someone is yelling and screaming for help that they're in the river. Once again, that first sibling jumps down into the river, tries to swim on over. But as they're in the river, they're noticing that there's dozens and dozens of people flowing down the river, all stuck in the river, potentially drowning as well. So that first sibling, what their goal is to run out, swim over to that person and bring them to shore one after another. So that first sibling is swimming out to all the people, bringing them back to shore and doing it over and over again. The second sibling is trying to figure out, okay, well, that sibling is doing this, so what can I do in this circumstance? That sibling might decide to find a rope to toss out to the people in the river to drag them onto shore. Maybe there's a couple of rocks that they can jump onto to get into the middle of the river and help them up onto the rocks and help walk them to shore. Trying to think of alternative methods to be able to help these people who are drowning in the river. Finally, the third sibling takes a moment to think about what is going on. That sibling knows that ahead there is a bridge that, typically people are able to, walk over the bridge and be okay, not being able to fall into that river. So that sibling goes upriver a little bit and notices that the bridge has actually collapsed. So that sibling has gone to the actual roots of the problem because trying to figure out why these people continue to be falling into the river, right? And that is the goal of prevention, is to actually look at the root of the problem. So why people are falling into the river. So for example, in this story, it was that the bridge had collapsed, but other things, it could be that someone's actually pushing people into the river. Maybe there is actually something that is valuable in the river to some people. There could be so many different reasons, right? But the goal of prevention that we are talking about at MNCASA is that we want to look at what the root of the problem is. And something that I want to be clear about is that all these three types of siblings are much needed and absolutely important to responding to victims and survivors. So we need to have those folks who are, jumping and swimming over to the people who are, in the crisis at that moment and being able to bring them ashore. We have to have other folks who are trying to think of alternative strategies about how to help as well. But we also need folks who are trying to address the roots of the problem too, right? So I know that we are talking about this third sibling in terms of prevention, but once again, want to be clear that every single type of sibling in this context is very valuable and much needed when we're talking about sexual violence. Just want to check the chat once again. All right, so it looks like Willie had a brief question here. So how do you promote the prevention of sexual violence in minority group when language is a barrier? Thank you so much for that question, Willie. I think I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in a moment, but I do want to address it very briefly. So once again, Willie had asked, how do you promote the prevention of sexual violence in minority groups when language is a barrier? So first of all, I think it's very important to talk about sexual violence in general, right? So oftentimes, we might have this very formalized language. So we talk about what primary prevention is, which I will be talking about soon, or we talk about bystander intervention, or we talk about rape culture. And I think these terms and concepts they're very applicable and very important, especially when we're talking about direct service and systems advocate folks. Being able to be aware of these terms and the impact and influence of them. But when we're talking to folks within the community, they might not have that actual language. And so being able to have very inclusive language when you're doing these presentations. So you don't have to name bystander intervention, for example, but essentially talking about how anyone has the potential and the responsibility to create a safer environment for everyone. Because then that does help reduce rape culture, for example. So we want to build from the ground up and saying that everyone has the ability to jump into these situations to help out folks. And what this is bystander intervention, for example. So building from where your audience is coming from, having that inclusive information that everyone can be able to relate to is going to be very important. But once again, I will talk about that a little bit later, but just wanted to, address that real quick and real briefly. All right, just want to make sure. All right, perfect. Thanks so much for those questions, guys. Really love that people are wanting to engage during the presentation as well. So thank you. So I did explain this a little bit on the previous slide, but I do want to talk about how all these types of service, when we're talking about these three different types of siblings, are needed within the experience and assistance for victims and survivors. So that first sibling was really that direct service advocate once again. So these can be advocates from rape crisis centers or even law enforcement officers, but these are the people who are in that crisis mode trying to stamp out fires all over the place. So they are helping people at the outset of experiencing that type of violence as soon as possible, right? That second sibling is that systems advocate individual. So this can be other types of organizations that are involved. So this can be healthcare professionals. So for example, someone who is a SANE nurse, a sexual assault nurse examiner who might provide any type of testing after a sexual assault for someone. This could also be folks who are in the criminal justice system as well, right? So folks who are responding, maybe not at the outset of that actual experience of violence, but afterwards then responding to it. Finally, we have that third sibling who is working on prevention. And once again, we're going to really take a deep dive into what prevention is in general. And this, looking at this general graphic, this is not to say that prevention is the most important or anything like that, but it's looking at, once again, with prevention, systems advocacy, and direct service, the victim and survivor should always be at the center of that experience and how you are supposed to respond in that circumstance. So making sure that you are being trauma informed, making sure that you are being victim and survivor centered and led when you are doing this work as well. So jumping into what prevention is a little bit more, when we are talking about prevention, our goal is to address what primary prevention is. And essentially that is preventing violence before it ever has the chance to even occur. So that is before someone is harmed or someone actually causes that harm. So once again, that is the goal of primary prevention, is to stop violence from even happening in the first place. So once again, I know that there are different further levels. So for example, there's secondary prevention and tertiary prevention. So that's looking at responding to violence when it happens, making sure that that person has different types of services as well, but also making sure that additional violence might not happen to that person as well, right? And that is also very important, but I do want to be clear that our goal is talking about preventing violence before it ever even has the chance of occurring. And going into this a little bit further, the biggest goal, once again, in how we are talking about going to that bridge to see if it collapsed or why people are falling into the river, is because we want to address the root causes that influence sexual violence once again. And so that is looking at so many different causes. So once again, there's a spectrum of what can potentially cause sexual violence. So on one partial end of the spectrum, we have experiencing that actual violence. So that's the manifestation of that violence. So it can be that sexual violence, it can be that rape or sexual assault, it can be trafficking or stalking. So once again, the actual manifestation of that sexual violence. Next, what we also have that influences sexual violence, we have things like rape culture. So living in a society that actually upholds and reinforces harm and violence specifically towards women, for example, is what rape culture is talking about. But we also have things like rape jokes, right? Or victim blaming. So these things also continue to uphold the root causes of sexual violence. But on the other end of the spectrum, which once again is the very foundation, the root causes of sexual violence is oppression. So when we're looking at oppression, we're looking at what I like to call all the isms of society, those harmful isms. So looking at sexism and classism, racism, ableism, trans and homophobia as well. And obviously there's additional intersections there as well, but these are a lot of the very important ones. We can look at ageism as well, things like that too. But once again, primary prevention looks at addressing these root causes. So it's very important to be able to look at all these different types of oppression and look at how they influence the root causes of sexual violence. So just kind of addressing some of these, for example. So looking at ableism, just folks who have different types of ability. Oftentimes, folks who are disabled, like if we go back to those statistics that I had shared earlier, oftentimes they're at higher rates of risk of experiencing forms of violence. Looking at trans, homophobia, and biphobia as well. Obviously, folks, especially when we are talking about transgender individuals, that number was 47% of all transgender folks experience violence, and specifically that sexual violence at some point throughout their life. So half of all transgender individuals, that is rooted within transphobia, right? And discrimination against those marginalized folks as well. Looking at sexism between specifically masculine identified folks and feminine identified folks. Obviously, the numbers are over 90% of all perpetrators of sexual violence are men, but also we have to look at the roots of sexism as well. So this glamorization of violence against women, or this glamorization of pornography and violence pornography in our society as well can be other examples. Excuse me. But also, you might be wondering what this doll on the right is. And I think once again, like I was saying before, is this idea of intersectionality. And whenever I talk about intersectionality, I really like to use this example of the Russian doll. For example, if folks are familiar with what Russian dolls are, there's actually, you can see right on the slide that there is this Russian doll, but inside there are smaller and smaller and smaller Russian dolls, right? That all look the same, but they're just smaller and smaller and smaller. There could be up to 10 dolls in this actual Russian doll, right? And how I like to explain this is that you as a person are this Russian doll on the outside, but on the inside, you have all these different types of identities, these social categories that influence your lived experience. So how you identify with your gender, your race, your sexual orientation, your ability, so many different things like that. And each social category is actually a Russian doll, right? So kind of breaking that down into how you identify. So how you identify with your gender has an influence, but then also how you identify with your sexual orientation has an influence. But also when we're talking about intersectionality, when those things cross, that also has an influence on you as well. So for example, if we jump back to the left side looking at oppression, when we're intersecting LGBTQIA plus folks and race, so for example, specifically trans people of color, those people experience extremely high rates of violence. So when we're talking about intersecting these marginalized and oppressed communities, oftentimes that risk of violence is very much increased as well, right? So when we're talking about women of color, for example, that is also increased. Obviously, when we're talking about, for example, when I work with sex trafficked youth, we call oftentimes one term for those folks are sexually exploited youth, so SEY folks. And oftentimes these folks can be youth of color, they can be oftentimes women, they can also be transgender folks, but also can be homeless folks. So looking at all of these combined and intersecting types of oppression, if we are able to really be looking at creating the foundation of our work to respond to sexual violence and helping those people out at the margins who have the most marginalized and oppressed identities at the bottom, we're then able to help everyone else going up from there, if that makes sense. So once again, want to talk about how we address these root causes of sexual violence will then help prevent sexual violence as well. I want to check the chat one more time here. So someone asked, do you have any advice on how best to juggle the work of all three siblings when by default they're the only one in a specific case management role? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that question. I think that is difficult, right? So it's really hard to ask someone to be able to do all of these things, right? And we know that in the field of advocacy work and being in the anti-violence movement, that it's so hard for people to be, working on all these different things all at once, having that vicarious trauma and potential burnout. It's hard to do all of that at once. But as someone being a case manager, for example, you might not be that direct service provider, but you might be identifying as that systems advocate person. So that might be, that could be reaching out and collaborating with other systems advocacy folks, making sure that they are trauma informed, making sure that they are victim and survivor centered, and making sure that there's relationships across that sibling spectrum, for instance. So making sure that everyone has those same foundational understandings of how we center that victim and survivor. I think that's very important once again. Just want to check the chat one more time as well. And please, if you need me to clarify any information, I am happy to do that as well. And thank you so much, Carrie, for sharing what the actual Russian term for Russian dolls are. I'm not sure if I'll be saying it right, but a matryoshka doll is the Russian doll. So thank you so much for that example, Carrie. All right, I also wanted to talk about this idea of primary prevention versus risk reduction. So looking at this, once again, primary prevention is looking at preventing violence from ever occurring in the first place. But historically, there has been a large emphasis on what we call risk reduction. And so examples of risk reduction are, for example, having rape whistles. Also making sure that potential victims or survivors are covering their drinks when they go out, making sure that they buy their own drinks, for example. It can also be not dressing, quote unquote, in a promiscuous way, right? So to be clear, these ideas and examples of risk reduction puts the onus and responsibility on the potential or the actual victim or survivor, right? And we don't want to put any more additional responsibility on these folks than we have to. And when we're looking at these examples of risk reduction, oftentimes they are centered within that idea of victim blaming. So for example, looking at how people dress, obviously it does not matter how people dress. If they are sexually assaulted, obviously we can only blame that perpetrator in that circumstance, right? So while we have to be aware of that, some risk reduction strategies can be helpful because it does in some ways emphasize groups to be safe. We really want to focus on ideas of primary prevention because we don't want to continue to put additional responsibilities on potential victims and survivors, which risk reduction does. And so we are really trying to shift our perspective, going away from that risk reduction approach to what primary prevention is. So preventing sexual violence from ever happening in the first place. So also kind of looking at more ideas of what prevention can include. So obviously what we've already talked about with addressing root causes. So that is a very important context within that spectrum. So looking at the actual centered experiences of oppression, looking at things like rape culture and victim blaming, but then also the actual manifestation of those types of violence, but also challenging norms, right? So that example is looking at, how we talk about sexual violence because there's such a glamorization of sexual violence in our culture. If we are able to confront that, that would also help prevent sexual violence too as well, right? Additionally, if we have policy as well within our, not only just on a federal level, but state levels and also community levels, right? So I think that's very important to know is that when we're talking about policy, it doesn't have to be across the nation. It can be within your own community. It can be within your own organization of having certain organizational practices as well. Also, I think education is a big thing that folks like to emphasize a lot. So that's education about what healthy relationships are, what consent is. It's talking about the reality of what sexual violence actually looks like, right? So going back, historically, sexual violence was portrayed as this stranger hiding in the bush and waiting to attack any potential victims and survivors, right? We do know that that obviously does happen. So stranger rape happens, but by and large, it's about 80% of all victims and survivors in some way know their perpetrator as well. So just having that important education, it makes that community, that age group, anything like that, have the skills to be able to challenge these root causes or norms when it comes to sexual violence. Additionally, changing environments. So that can be your community, that can be your workplace, so many different things like that, right? So really changing the place that you are in and also the many different places that you're in. So that can be as a young person within who's in high school, that can be challenging environments within your home, within your school, within your sports teams that you might be working with, but obviously in your workplace as well, right? So really being able to look at this as a spectrum, which we will once again be talking about in a moment too. Know that we also had something going on in the chat. Let me check that once again. All right, Kristen is sharing that a great app for safety is Noonlight. I'm not familiar, but would definitely be happy to check that out. Thank you so much, Kristen. All right, do you know, someone asked, do you know of any current legislation that's being discussed or considered related to sexual assault? Well, I know, for example, I think this is kind of constantly going on, but at least in the Minnesota context, I'm familiar. Folks in the Minnesota area or region might be familiar with this example of an intoxication law by the Supreme Court of Minnesota. I know that there's a lot of talk about this, but I know that historically this has been in place. So basically, there was a sexual assault case that the Supreme Court recently ruled that if there's any type of voluntary consumption of alcohol, that can potentially negate that sexual assault had actually occurred if someone is voluntarily consuming alcohol, and that has recently in the state of Minnesota had tons of attention on social media across organizations as well. But definitely combating that. And this is not to say that the Supreme Court, approves of, sexual assault or anything like that. But it is important that this is a loophole that the defendants of this case have utilized. So being aware of, obviously, if someone voluntarily consumes alcohol, by no means are they asking for to be sexually assaulted, right? So that's just one recent example. I can definitely pull up additional articles that have really circulated the last couple weeks in the state of Minnesota. And my apologies as I'm not extremely familiar, but once again, I'm happy to share some information. Additionally, something I'll talk about later is affirmative action or affirmative consent laws as well. So that's actually where there has to be an explicit yes when it talks about consent and sexual activity as well, which I'll get to a little bit later. So I know that there's constantly different, legislation being proposed and being, prepped and ready from other organizations, but those are just a couple that came to mind right away. So thanks so much for that question. All right, folks. So as I was saying before, I did want to address what the spectrum of prevention is as well. So it's very important that, some folks might just latch on to certain points of what prevention might be. So, educating your youth, for example, obviously that's huge and important, but something that is potentially an issue when we only focus on one part of the spectrum of prevention is, we love educating youth, and that is a huge part. But if we are giving youth all of the great, awesome skills to be able to have great, healthy relationships and being able to educate on rape culture, and then they go into these environments at work or in larger society where no one else is practicing those skills, oftentimes we're going to be setting up these youth for failure, right? So that's why we need to be working on educating youth, but also everyone within our community too, right? So we really need to be able to look at many different factors all at once when we're talking about prevention. So obviously, if we're looking at the spectrum of prevention from the bottom up, we're looking at strengthening individual knowledge and skills. So this piece is very important. Obviously, that we as individuals, especially as direct service providers, we have to have the knowledge and skills to be able to educate ourselves and others when we are talking about sexual violence in general, right? That is so huge. But next, on that next part of the spectrum is that we have to promote community education as well. So I know that a lot of organizations, a lot of advocacy centers do a lot of community education. So they're going in to the different local schools, middle schools, high schools, even colleges and universities, doing a lot of potential kitchen table conversations or luncheons as well. Maybe going over to collaborative partners and just providing a lot of this information, which is huge too, right? And then similar to what we're already talking about is educating providers. So continuing to educate providers within the sexual violence fields, but also folks within systems advocacy, right? So looking at folks in the criminal justice systems, looking at healthcare professionals, so many folks like that, right? Because it's so important to have that trauma-informed lens or that victim or survivor-centered care as well, because we know that victims and survivors come into contact with a lot of systems, right? And we really need to encourage other types of folks, other systems to be able to have these same skills, because once again, we want to be able to have victims and survivors be supported and then heal from that experience as well. Additionally, on the next part, we have fostering coalitions and networks. So once again, creating additional collaborative networks within your spaces and creating partnerships as an organization. But for instance, at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, we are a statewide organization that works with rape crisis centers, other partners across the state, right? And we know that there's going to be victims and survivors of every different kind of background all across the state of Minnesota. And it might look different where you are in the state or once again across the nation, right? So really being able to create those relationships on a statewide but also national level is going to be huge. Additionally, looking at changing organizational practices that can be within your own organization. So oftentimes folks think of initially sexual harassment within the workplace, like how do we address that? That can be, creating incentives. It can be creating, obviously, when folks participate in that behavior, having repercussions, obviously, so many different things like that. So within your organization and within your partnerships as an organization, having those practices on how to help prevent sexual violence as well. And then finally, looking at influencing policy and legislation. So once again, this does not just have to be at a federal level. It can be within your own city, right? So having city protocols or different best practices to follow is going to be very important too. So we know that on the levels of policy is very up high, right? So that influences so many different people and it's kind of a funnel, right? So we're looking at policy and legislation on a very high level, but then you're strengthening your individual self-knowledge, right? So we don't have to do just things ourselves. We can do things all the way up to a national, even an international level, right? And it's very important that even one single strategy can be stretched across these different types of levels of the spectrum of prevention too, right? So if we look at community level education, so you can be providing that education, but also promoting and asking and lobbying for different changes to your legislation in your community. So one specific type of initiative could be educating themselves, educating their community providers, educating folks on a coalition if they're collaborating with those folks, while also trying to lobby for policy and legislation change, right? So one single initiative can be looking at every single level of this spectrum. And sometimes depending on what is going to be best for you as an organization, because we know that sometimes we can only achieve so much, sometimes it helps digging deeper rather than broader. So if you know as an organization that you are very good at reaching out to your community partnerships and doing that education, really try to focus on that and continue creating a broader outreach of doing that, right? Because if you feel like you don't have the skills of doing that policy and legislation, you can try to partner with other organizations who are more better equipped or funded to do that, but really trying to stretch these or dig deep sometimes can be very important as well. Just looking at a few of the comments, love that y'all are still continuing to be active as we are chatting about this too. Answered that. All right, so I know that it's about 11:10. Want to make sure that we're getting through all this content today. So next, I wanted to talk about this briefly again, because this is the Stop SV Sexual Violence Technical Package by the CDC. And this has always been helpful at MNCASA with our prevention team that we've been chatting about, because once again, it talks about all of these key components when we are talking about trying to prevent sexual violence. So I think this is just another very helpful graphic for folks to be aware of. So number one, looking at promoting social norms that protect against sexual violence. If we have folks who are stepping in as that active bystander to help reduce harm or prevent violence from occurring, or we're creating a culture that does not allow for rape jokes or victim blaming, that is promoting healthy social norms that does then help prevent sexual violence. Number two, looking at T, which is teaching skills to prevent sexual violence. Obviously, we are talking about education here. Additionally, looking at being opportunities to support and empower women and girls. So looking at folks who are primarily experiencing this type of sexual violence or the potential victims or survivors as well. So looking at those opportunities to help support and empower those folks as well. Looking at creating protective environments as well. So if we have communities that are wanting to create a healthy environment, healthy as in preventing sexual violence, but also eliminating harmful and degrading language, all of those aspects help create a healthier and safer community as well. Additionally, just in general, supporting victims and survivors, that part is huge, right? So if we are actually centering victims and survivors' experiences once again, and supporting those most marginalized, we're then going to be able to uplift everyone else as well. So once again, just to be clear, another quick resource for folks to be aware of too. Once again, I did want to talk about some of the key components which we've already discussed. So having very positive, actionable approaches. So people are really able to get behind positive aspects. So talking about healthy relationships and consent, those are really positive, actionable approaches and strategies that people can get behind, and making sure that they're going to be actionable. So making sure that we're not talking about this just in theory, but being able to provide actionable examples of how we can do this in practice too, right? Making sure that this is going to be creative and new as well, right? So I think that piece is going to be very helpful for engagement and looking for additional collaboration from folks. Having that be creative is really going to have people foster more collaboration with your organization or your initiative. Creating more partnerships, that piece is huge as well. Additionally, evaluation is huge, right? So I think we know that we have tons and tons of different curriculum, right? And how we talk about healthy relationships, but as long as we can have that be research-based and look back to that research and evaluative thinking, that piece is going to be very helpful. One example of this is Safe Dates. Safe Dates has actually recently, done a whole bunch of evidence-based training that is rooted within evaluation, so they can actually look back to see how their different measurements and practices actually help influence their curriculum and educational processes too, right? But some examples of evaluation can obviously be surveys directed at interested populations. It can be surveys to victims and survivors. There can be environmental scans or hotspot mapping, ripple effect mapping. So just being aware of how this aspect of evaluation can really help bolster any type of prevention work that you're doing. Making sure, once again, that it's community driven. So if you have buy-in by other folks in the community to really create that healthier and safer environment and community for folks, that's going to then create a whole lot of incentive to then prevent sexual violence, for example. So making sure that those community those folks in the community, but also those community organizations have that buy-in really creates how unique your community might be compared to other places. So making sure to be community driven and to have that community buy-in is extremely important. Finally, having a balanced evidence-based and promising practices similar to that evaluative practice, that's going to be very important too. Once again, we have some folks asking if slides will be available. Yes, they will be available for y'all. All right, well, I did want to provide an example of what prevention looks like, and this is actually from MNCASA, the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and what we do within our prevention team. And what we used as our catalyst for prevention is creating the Rosemary Project. So as you can see, with our Rosemary Project at MNCASA, we are talking about community level change, because once again, if we are only focusing on creating those individualized skills, especially if we're looking at providing those skills to youth and they go out into a world that is not practicing those same values to prevent sexual violence, that is very hard to create those additional partnerships and those relationships. So that's why we really try to emphasize community level change. So once again, I'm happy to provide additional resources or any other PDFs, guides, anything like that about our Rosemary project. But I did want to be sure just to provide you all with a concrete example of what community level prevention work looks like. And so on this next page, I actually had just a brief video about what the Rosemary project is at MNCASA. So just wanted to share this quick video with you all.
So imagine you want to start a garden. You hop online, type how to start a garden, and the moment you hit return, you're flooded with an avalanche of options. Is it botanical? Is it vegetable? Is it sustainable? How do you keep wildlife from eating your plants? What does this thing do? In the end, it's so overwhelming, you don't even know where to begin. But what if you started small? Something as simple as buying and nurturing a small herb like rosemary would be an easy way to get started. From there, you can continue to take small steps until you have a beautiful garden. Now imagine you want to cultivate something much bigger, like a healthy community. Perhaps you want to help prevent sexual violence. So you head to the computer again and, well, how do we teach healthy relationship skills? How do we challenge media that objectifies women? How do we encourage people to intervene when they see something that is making someone else feel at risk? How can we create environments where people not only feel safe, but are safe? Again, you don't have to do everything at once. You can build momentum by starting small. How about starting right now, you take a pledge to intervene whenever you hear a sexist joke? It's a simple way to begin changing negative behaviors within our social circles. From there, we can begin the work of making our communities a safer, more vibrant place. To find more simple steps you can take to prevent sexual violence in your community, you can visit MNCASA.org/prevent.
All right, folks, so that is just a brief example of what some type of community level prevention might look like. So once again, that is MNCASA's Rosemary project. And so I do want to be aware of time because we do have to talk about healthy relationships a little bit. So once again, I'm sure that most folks are familiar, but want to make sure that I at least address some of that as well. So right here, want to be aware that looking at community level change, once again, we have the individual, the relationship, community, and societal too. And so that is this idea of a socio-ecological model. So everyone has a role to play, and we really want to be able to shift across all of these different types of levels too. All right, so once again, just wanted to be able to talk a little bit about healthy relationship skills. And just to be clear, these are some of the practices that I utilize when I am educating youth on healthy relationship skills. And it might look very different as to how you or your organization might do that, but I am emphasizing educating youth with healthy relationships as well. And so looking at these are the four main central themes that I try to emphasize when talking about healthy relationships. That is obviously differentiating between what is healthy and what is unhealthy when it comes to relationships, what consent is, looking at the impact of gender stereotypes, and emphasizing trust and support. And I do, if we have some time, want to be able to loop in how we can add specific strategies of the spectrum of prevention as well. So looking at healthy versus unhealthy relationships, obviously looking at how to differentiate between the two, right? So talking about that relationships are like tacos. It takes a lot of work, right? So we really have to have that trust, that communication, making sure that everyone is from an equal perspective. So for example, not one person is hoarding certain types of resources that might be financial or even the car, anything like that within the relationship. But also how we look at abusive relationships, right? So some examples here are gaslighting, so that idea of crazy making within relationships. Obviously things that are specifically violent in nature, that can be physical, verbal violence, anything that can be financial or emotional as well too. So unhealthy relationships, really looking at those degrading aspects as well, that might be minimizing, denying, or blaming as well. So a lot of those very clear indicators of what is healthy versus what is unhealthy. But when I talk about these different examples with youth, I do think it's very important to note that even if one youth relationship has one healthy factor, for example, that is not to say that the relationship is inherently abusive, for example, but it really is a way to encourage youth to talk about, hey, let's have communication, healthy communication, to be able to address this red flag in the relationship. And that's how we really try to emphasize talking about unhealthy relationships, is that red flag. So saying that, hey, be aware of this in the future. And if it continues to progress or get worse, you might really have to reevaluate that relationship once again, right? But once again, just trying to be very clear in how relationships might be healthy versus unhealthy as well. And I think it's very important to be able to cater to youth. So how youth are very involved within just discovering new relationships, how relationships might be very new, and also the influences of social media. Once again, I know that this is just a 101 training, but really looking at how social media can really influence healthy and unhealthy relationships when we're talking about youth is very important as well. Real quick, jumping into consent here. You might be familiar with this graphic by Planned Parenthood, because I love talking about consent with this acronym. I know that if we just talk about consent being this huge long paragraph of a definition, it's really easy for youth to get turned off by that. So just giving them this quick FRIES acronym, being freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. I think that's a very relatable and easy way for youth to be able to identify with what consent is, and especially this enthusiastic piece. So looking at body language, I think that piece is going to be very important when you're talking to youth. And specifically, some very important factors to be aware of when we're talking about consent is this idea of the lack of a no or silence does not mean yes. And additionally, this saying no does not mean convince me, right? So it's not this continual, consistent and persistent, like, hey, do you want to do this, for example, or do you want to have sex with me, right? That is not a part of what consent is. And obviously, we're talking about consent within healthy relationships. But I think it's also so important to be able to talk about consent in general, because we utilize consent each and every single day, multiple times a day, right? And so we need to be able to talk about, we ask for consent when we ask our classmate, hey, can I use that pencil? Or when we ask our parents to hang out with a friend, right? We're utilizing consent every single day, all the time. So that should be no different when we're talking about sex or healthy relationships. And it's also important to not talk about consent as a contract where you have to check off all these different aspects or factors, but instead it's really about communication and being able to check in with that other person, especially when we're talking about youth and sexual activity too, right? Additionally, talking about gender stereotypes, I think this piece is very, very important, because we know a lot of research shows that heavy influence of traditional gender stereotypes can be more easy to identify or engage within violent types of behavior as well. So just being clear that gender stereotypes, so heavy emphasis on how men are supposed to react and how women stereotypically are supposed to react within relationships, has a large influence in how we talk about sex, consent, and healthy relationships. And one thing we often talk about is the man box and the woman box. So looking and listing all these types of stereotypes, so that men should be strong, stoic, and really be on the prowl constantly for sexual activity. Whereas women are stereotypically seen as passive or submissive, things like that, and how that really has a real big impact when we talk about consent too, right? But one thing I do want to be clear in adding quick to is how transphobia, homophobia, and biphobia also influence gender stereotypes. So for example, oftentimes both men and women are corralled into these ideas of gender stereotypes by any potential social violations of, for example, if men do not constantly be on the prowl for women and sex, then they might be perceived as gay or something like that, for example. And that is usually utilized to keep men and women within their certain gender stereotypes again. So just a quick example there. Lastly, just because I know that we got a few minutes left and want to make sure we open it up for any questions, talking about trust and support, specifically finding a trusted adult is going to be so important, especially for youth, and making sure that we are not victim blaming when someone discloses to someone. So making sure that you are supporting that individual, saying, I believe you, that you're not alone, that your feelings are valid, are so very important as well. Because we know that if it's the very first time someone is disclosing and they are confronted with someone who says, are you sure that happened? Or I know this person, they would never do something like that. When we're talking about sexual violence, it's quite unlikely that that victim or survivor is going to reach out to anyone again, right? Because they likely already had those internalized feelings of guilt or that it was their fault. And then having that be reinforced is really a negative, huge negative impact on that individual. So really trying to uplift this idea of supporting people and trying to find those trusted adults within our communities and environments for youth is going to be so very important as well. So with that, I know that was a very quick just breeze through with all the types of healthy relationships that we talk about at MNCASA, specifically with youth, but wanted to make sure that I left some time open if anyone had any general thoughts, comments, or questions. And obviously, if folks have anything that I possibly missed or needed to clarify, please let me know about that as well. So I'll just give folks a couple of minutes. And please let me know if I can answer anything. I would love to do that. I'll just jump to this next slide really quick, just in case anyone wanted to reach out to me individually. So you can see that my email address is right there, but also how you can contact me via phone. I am happy to provide additional information to Brennison about resources. The slides will be provided to everyone, anything else like that. But I am happy to collaborate, answering questions, anything along those lines as well. Let me just check the chat, seeing if folks are saying anything. All right, yes, and Brennison is talking about getting that certificate. Yes, that is wonderful for folks as well. But yes, just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone, especially to Brennison and folks at Women's Advocates for allowing me to be here today as well. But please always feel free to reach out. I'm definitely happy to answer any questions or collaborate with folks as well.
Thank you so much, Hunter. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And feel free again to always reach out. We hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you.